So the U.S. continues to wage war in still Iraq and still Syria. Now, the original Iraq war that was declared, oh gosh, what's it been? Almost 20 years at this point. That war is long over. We've had many Iraq wars, the U.S. has, over the years. This is just the latest one. I've lost count of how many they are. I guess you would say the first one was back in 91. 2003 Iraq War was number 2, and then we've had a few since then. It's kind of hard to draw the lines between one or the other. And of course, the war in Syria has been ongoing since 2011. The U.S. has been involved the entire time, despite the fact that Congress not only has never approved any kind of war in Syria, they have explicitly shot down the idea on multiple occasions. There has never been support in Congress or in the United States at large, amongst the populace and the citizenry for any kind of U.S. war in Syria, yet there has been one now for 10 years, okay? I believe all the way back in 2011 was when it started, and that was 10 years ago. And so who is it that the U.S. is fighting in Syria? Are these the old al-Qaeda guys who are still up to their old tricks? The same guys who blew up the Twin Towers on 9/11? The people who we're all supposed to hate, and who people joined the military to go fight after 9/11? Are these the guys who the U.S. is fighting over there, albeit illegally? And the answer, of course, is a big fat no. The folks who the U.S. decided to bomb yesterday are the people who are actually fighting al-Qaeda. The U.S. has been acting as al-Qaeda's air force in a number of different wars over the years for a very long time now, for as long as I can remember. It's actually I don't remember a time in my life, because I was too young at the time, when the U.S. actually was fighting against al-Qaeda. For as long as I've been politically aware of and following the news, the U.S. has been fighting on behalf of al-Qaeda. And the way that they conceal this, the way that that the U.S. Spins the fact that they are fighting in the Middle East for al-Qaeda, to empower the followers of Osama bin Laden and his fellow travelers, is by sparing anyone who opposes al-Qaeda as puppets of Iran, which, may or may not be true to varying degrees depending on who specifically you're talking about. Because obviously, anyone who is associated with Iran, a Shiite country, is going to be very much against bin Laden and his followers and al-Qaeda and their whole ideology, since they are the bin Ladenites are Sunni Muslims. So yeah, obviously, anyone who's associated with Iran is automatically going to be anti-al-Qaeda. But I would think that's a good thing. I wouldn't think that's a bad thing. And so in the context of wars between al-Qaeda and some other group, I would think that calling someone pro-Iran, relatively speaking, even if you don't like Iran, would be a positive thing. Those would be the people who you would think, well, gee, we might not like Iran, we might not like that they make women wear headscarves in public or whatever, or we might have some other problems with Iran, like the hostage crisis, but at least the Iranians are somewhat reasonable people who are civilized and have a normal country, and you can talk to them, like human beings, whereas, the al-Qaeda guys are monsters. Al-Qaeda are the people who blow up buildings and massacre civilians. Iran doesn't do that. The worst thing you could say Iran did was, well, they took a bunch of Americans hostage. But the Iranian hostage crisis is nothing like 9/11. It's nothing like the attack on the Khobar Towers, which, incidentally, if I remember correctly, the U.S. tried to also blame on Iran. So our new president, Joe Biden, surprise, surprise, is not all that different from our old president, Barack Obama, who also spent his entire presidency pretty much trying to empower al-Qaeda. Trump rolled that back a little bit. I've always given him credit for that, for defunding al-Qaeda in Syria. Doing so struck a serious blow to ISIS and al-Qaeda. Of course, ISIS and al-Qaeda are relatively, for the purposes of an American looking in the macro sense at the Middle East, you can sort of conflate Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They believe the same things, and they're just as bad. They're all bad people, and they have similar beliefs. So in a war like this, they would tend to be somewhat aligned, even though ISIS is technically a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. But for example, you could not conflate, let's say, Al-Qaeda with Iran or something like that. They're very clearly on opposite sides, no matter where the conflict is. And so in the name of fighting Iran, the U.S. continues to empower these people. And if that wasn't bad enough, if that wasn't insulting enough to the people of Syria, who have now spent 10 years trying to just get by in their lives, their civil war has gone on for a decade. The U.S. has made that as their rebuilding process as difficult as possible by sanctioning the rebuilding process of Syria, preventing them from importing oil. And you might think to yourself, gee, why would Syria need to be importing oil in order to rebuild their country? Aren't they a major oil producer? Aren't they, one of these Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq, who has a bunch of oil out in the desert that's just waiting to be, drilled and sucked out of the ground and put to productive use? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. In theory, but in practice, the United States has seized all of Syria's oil wells, or at least the vast majority of them. There's a major U.S. presence in ez-zor, which is in the far east of Syria, near where these Kataib Hezbollah militias were, who were bombed by Joe Biden's America. And, that was really the one big thing that Trump did in Syria, was he said, you know what, okay, sure, we're not pulling out of Syria. The generals told me I can't do that. I'm not allowed to, because I'm, and I'm a weak little boy who, even though I'm the president, I take orders from the generals. And so they told me we can't leave Syria, so at the very least, what I'm going to do, if we're going to stay in Syria, we're going to keep the oil. We're going to take that oil, just like we should have taken the oil back in Iraq. And so, by golly, Trump kept his word, and the troops rolled up to the oil fields, and they took the oil. All of the oil in Syria now belongs to America. And so I would think that would make the United States in Syria a pretty big target for folks who want to, who have any interest in rebuilding that country. Namely, these quote-unquote Iranian-backed militias. Which, I have no reason, I'm not trying to put scare quotes there, I'm just saying that's how the U.S. refers to them. I'm sure they are Iranian-backed to a great extent. Iran is one of Syria's remaining allies, along with Russia. And so these militia groups have a great interest in trying to take the oil back from the United States. So it's really hard for me to find any way to spin this in America's favor. Even as an American, I want to think, hey, what's the good patriotic take on this issue? How do I, how can I think of this to where it doesn't make me ashamed of my government? And I can't really think of any way to spin this that doesn't make me ashamed of my government. Because I just mean that, the U.S. in this case is they're so clearly the bad guys. Like it's unambiguous. You just marched into a country that didn't invite you there, and you took their oil, and you're just sitting on it, and you're keeping them. If that if that wasn't bad enough, you won't even let them buy oil from other countries. And so, am I supposed to feel bad when there's mortars shot at this U.S. base in ez-zor, around the oil fields? No, how am I supposed to feel bad about it? How am I supposed to condemn the Iranian-backed militias when they're just trying to retake something that was stolen by a bunch of foreigners who don't even speak their language? And so, what, I'm supposed to be against them and say that they have no claim to this, this oil as a country because they're friends with Iran and the U.S. doesn't like Iran? I mean, it's just shameless. And the fact that the Pentagon can put out a press release about that and then it's not a scandal. Like, they didn't have to hide this. They put out a press release saying that they bombed these groups over there. And now, we've got the report that they are trying to retaliate and take back the oil fields. I mean, it really is. It's also tough to think that other Americans don't get upset about these things. Now, it doesn't affect the lives of ordinary Americans, and if it did affect them, then, it would be a problem, and people would, acknowledge it maybe. But, as things stand right now, this doesn't affect us. We're this huge, big country that runs massive deficits every year, and so if the Pentagon is putting a few billion every year into waging war against the people of Syria and empowering the military-industrial complex, because that's what this is about. It's an excuse to keep buying more missiles from Raytheon to fire at the Iranian-backed militias. Who in America has time to worry about that? Americans have enough of their own problems. They don't have time to worry about the well-being of the people of Syria who have been put through hell thanks to the United States for, again, a decade. Okay, the Syrian civil war has been going on for a very, very long time. Same thing with Libya. Libya was also 2011. A decade of hell. Libya went from being the most successful country in Africa to being, a wasteland with open-air slave markets. It's been said time and time again, but again, obviously it hasn't been said enough because people don't care about it. And you still have clowns. You have total ghouls, demons on cable news. Who get on there and and try their best to apply a lot of makeup to hide their scales before making the case that it's too soon to pull the troops out. Oh, we can't come home yet. We have to avoid a precipitous withdrawal from the Middle East, from any one of these countries, even the places where nobody was ever asked if we should have a war like Syria. Oh no, we can't have a precipitous withdrawal. Well, think of the Kurds. Think of the Kurds. The Kurds that George H.W. Bush goaded into rising up against Saddam Hussein back in '91, who he then proceeded to abandon and allowed them to really be massacred because they rose up against Saddam Hussein, thinking that America had their back, and then America said, "Oh, sorry, we're going to pull a Bay of Pigs." So you're not going to fool us on that one. What's the excuse this time? What's the excuse for holding onto these Syrian oil fields? There is no excuse. They don't even try and make excuses anymore. They don't care. I have to say, the old-timey empires like Britain and Rome, at least they were open about what they were doing, and their people could be proud of them for that sake. They were proud that their country was strong and powerful, and that they were able to conquer a good chunk of the rest of the world, and that they were more powerful than other people. It's a very animalistic, but it's a natural sort of feeling. Whereas the Americans, they hide from their status as the global empire, as the most powerful country on earth. Who you don't just the most powerful country on earth in a vacuum. No, that's not good enough. The U.S. has to be the most powerful country on earth that also dominates the rest of the planet actively. They can't just walk softly and carry a big stick. That's a fiction. And so I just hate the dishonesty. This holier-than-thou nature where the U.S. pretends to be, oh, we're this great democracy and we respect norms and all of this nonsense. Whereas in reality, we're no different than those might-make-right empires of times past. And we should be remembered as such. So I guess that's about all I have to say on this topic. I will see folks back here tomorrow.